Hello, Mr. Fraser here, and in this short-ish video, I'm going to just talk through the Seamus Heaney poem Mid-Term Break. I'm going to do my best to go through it succinctly in order to aid your revision, and this is directed for a National 5 critical essay. So that's the specific context for how I'm approaching this poem. So I'm going to refer to a lot of my class resources from this most recent academic year, which I'm starting to present now. And the first thing you want to maybe consider when approaching this poem is think about the title, Mid-Term Break, and what you would usually associate with mid-term break. Usually that's a time of happiness, of joy. It's a time where you get a little bit of break from school. And so what we maybe expect as a reader going into this is something far more positive to what we actually end up with. So I'm going to skip through a few slides which are relevant to my class and my class only, and we're going to move straight into the annotation of the poem itself. But perhaps before we do that, we should just simply read through it. So we'll go through it stanza by stanza, I think, and then we'll start to talk about what techniques you can find and where. So as you see me just scrolling away through my class slides right now, what you're going to hopefully get to is a stanza by stanza annotation. And we're here, not very well prepared, are we? So the poem starts off with this stanza. I sat all morning in the college sick bay, counting bells knelling classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbours drove me home. So a really interesting first stanza. This establishes the first setting of the poem in terms of location. This young boy, this speaker, is sitting in the college sick bay, so sort of like a school medical room. Don't be misled by the word college. We're talking a young boy here at secondary school age. Counting bells knelling class to a close. Now, that's a really interesting phrase, bells knelling, because bells are usually happy things. We think of wedding bells, jingle bells. These are all things that we would associate with happiness. And even the school bell is associated with happiness. I mean, there's maybe the excitement and happiness of getting into school, or perhaps more in a more relatable way of getting out of school. But the crucial thing here is the use of that word knelling. Now, if you look up the word knelling, that's usually used to describe funeral sounds. It's the kind of bells that you hear not at a wedding, which are multi-tones and multi-notes, or jingle bells, which are quite high-pitched. No, knelling is a deep bell that you hear and associate with death, because it's the type of bells that we hear at funerals. So I'll give you a little audio example of what bells knelling sounds like. Now notice that it's two long, repetitive, exactly sounding the same bell chimes, dung, dung, dark, heavy and sad. And these are things that we hear when we're thinking of remembrance of death and of funerals. Now, that's interesting word choice in and of itself, but there's also that contrast built within it of bells and knelling, bells being happy, knelling being sad. And that actually foreshadows the sadness that will be elaborated on later on in the poem. So there's a few techniques happening at once here, but there's also, with that sound, bells knelling, assonance, which is kind of like alliteration, but more for vowels, where you get same sounding vowels. So bells knelling mimics that same repetitive sound that you get from two knelling bells. So the knelling bells, as you heard, is the dum, dum, two repetitive sounds. Bells knelling, bells, nails, it mimics that kind of style of sound, if that makes sense. He's then stuck in his car, picked up by the neighbours and driven home. So we are instantly, as a reader, thinking that something's clearly happened because he's been taken out of school. But we can't help but wonder, where are the parents or the guardians here? Because the neighbours are picking him up and taking him home. And of course, this is all building us up to the realization of what's happened, which we will get more information on in the next stanza. So that takes us to stanza 2. He's arrived home, and this is what he's confronted with. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride, and Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. So much happening here. Right. So, first of all, think about the fact that this poem was written a long time ago, long before we had today's more compassionate understanding of what was acceptable in terms of gender roles. Gender roles were far less fluid back then and much more stuck in binary traditions of men have to be manly and women have to be feminine. And of course, that's just not the reality of life nowadays. But make sure you keep that traditional idea in your head, because look at the enjambment here. So when you see "I met my father crying," you have this image of a father crying at the very end of the line. Now the sentence continues, but it's left isolated and hanging at the end of the line. That's enjambment as a technique, which is quite sad and quite tragic and quite shocking, which again gives us a real sense that something terrible has happened. It's sad because anyone crying is sad, but particularly in this day and age, the man of the house, the breadwinner, the leader of the house, the father crying, it must be something bad. So the tone goes from sad to pretty tragic at this point. He had always been quite a masculine guy, because it says that he's always taken funerals in his stride. He's the kind of man at funerals that kind of puts a brave face on things and comforts the crying women. But here he's broken down. So even in this pre-compassionate age, we see an example of real tragedy coming from the masculine point of view. It's real pathos here. And Big Jim Evans, presumably someone familiar, a family friend, would imagine, saying it was a hard blow. Now, that's quite interesting, the hard blow, because what Big Jim Evans means is the emotional hard blow, as in if you're going through a tough time or something difficult happens to you, you might say, oh, it's been quite a hard blow. But this is actually quite a crude foreshadowing of the revelation at the end of the poem, where we find out that his brother literally died because of a physical hard blow by being hit by a bus, something which did genuinely happen within Seamus Heaney's family. Stanza 3, the baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram, and when I came in, I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand. So, the baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram. Now, we already know from bells knelling and from the father crying that this is a sad occasion now. It's not a big, happy, joyful midterm break. So we've had a lot of sadness already. He's come into this house now where there's a great deal of formality. People have come together in this funeral. It's a sad environment. He's embarrassed by men standing up to shake his hand because he's now feeling like he's been treated like an adult as opposed to the child that he is. And it's a very respectful thing to do at funerals, to go up to someone and say, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. And that makes this young preteen boy quite embarrassed, for lack of a better phrase. But what I love most about this stanza is the contrast here. Now think about what babies represent. They're symbolic of birth, of life, of hope, of new beginnings. A baby has their entire life ahead of them, and there's a certain joy to that, a possibility of where that life could go. The baby itself is innocent of what's going on. It's cooing, it's laughing, it's having a great time, completely unaware that something tragic has happened. And that's a really sharp contrast. It really brings it into perspective, and it's a contrast that will be really driven home later in the poem, but it's established here. This baby being so happy and joyful amongst all the sadness. Well, think of it like this. On a hot summer's day, if somebody comes up to you from behind and pours a bucket of ice cold water over you, you're going to feel that shock. That contrast is going to stand out because of you've gone from very warm to very cold. And it's the same idea here. We've gone from very sad to very happy, and then we're going to get even more tragically sad when we learn more about why this baby is crying, why the baby's crying, why the family are crying, and why everyone is so sad. Moving on to the next stanza. This is a direct continuation of the last sentence. So the old men are standing up to shake the hand and tell me that they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest, away at school as my mother held my hand. Now, pay attention to the sound that I'm creating there with that stanza as I'm going through it. Whispers informed strangers that I was the eldest, away at school as my mother held my hand. Held my hand. So, what we have here is a good example of very skillful alliteration. But before I go kind of deep into that technique, just imagine what Heaney's going through here. They were sorry for my trouble, and he's in this room, and these whispers are happening around him. All these adults around him are looking at him as he's walked into the room going, that's the brother. He's away at school right now. And this is all happening whilst the mother held his hand. You might have walked in a room at points in your life and felt that people were talking about you. Well, this is happening to him, except he knows for sure that people are talking about him. They said they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest away at school as my mother held my hand. Lots of S's and H sounds there, so it creates a lot of S and H sounds, a lot of shh. It's a quiet, hushing, whispering sound. Death is quiet. Funerals are quiet things traditionally. And so Heaney is taking us and really encouraging us to feel the emotions and feel the atmosphere that he was experiencing in this environment. We're really getting a sense of that hush, because when you say the stanza aloud, you can't help but fall into a whisper. Whispers inform strangers I was the eldest away at school as my mother held my hand. Very hushy kind of shh sound to establish that funeral atmosphere, that sad, tragic atmosphere. The sentence then continues into the next stanza. In hers and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived with the corpse stanched and bandaged by the nurses. There's a few things I could say here, but the main thing I point out is this idea of angry, tearless sighs. Funerals are sad. You'd expect sadness and tears, not anger and a lack of tears. But what you've got to understand is that mum is probably at that stage in grief where she's past crying. She's all cried out. There are no tears left. And she's just angry now. She's just making this horrible guttural sound to convey not just her grief, but her utter despair at what's happened. And of course, that's only kind of the idea of grief and despair is only hammered home more when we now learn that a corpse is arriving. We still don't yet know who this corpse was, but we just know that there's very obviously been a death. Everybody's upset, mum and dad particularly. So the corpse stanched and bandaged by the nurses really brings home that idea. Moving on to the next stanza. Next morning, I went up to the bedroom. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks, paler now. So we really get a sense of how long he's been away at school. And he goes up and he sees this corpse. We still don't know who it is, though. Now, again, notice that alliteration. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. Lots of S's, lots of hushing noises again. And when you're in the presence of a corpse, if you've ever been in a situation, it's a very somber, very quiet and sudden affair. Also notice the use of the word snowdrops there. Snowdrops are a plant that we commonly associate with death and with funerals. And if you've ever seen an image of a snowdrop, you'll know that they droop, they kind of lean forward and they hang forward in the same way that the word snowdrops is literally hanging forward here with the enjambment that's happening. And that's very deliberate. The form of this literally matches what is happening, literally mimics the shape and the structure of a snowdrop. And it's not the only enjambment that we have here. We also get it with paler now, which really emphasizes this idea of this body being totally bereft of life. It's a tragic image. Now, all death is sad. All death is quiet. All death is a moment of reflection, I suppose, but it gets even more sad and even more tragic as we move to the last two stanzas, 7 and 8, which we get now. Wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple, he lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. No gaudy scars. The bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. And so this is the big reveal. And it goes from sad to almost frustrated and angry, much like the mum earlier in the poem who was coughing out angry, tearless sighs. Notice that metaphor there, poppy bruise. The bruise is going to resemble a poppy, right? So it's been described as a poppy bruise because he's got this big bruise on his temple, which is probably big, it's circular and red like a poppy. But of course, think about what we associate with poppies with that metaphor. We associate poppies with Remembrance Day, with death and remembrance. He lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot, a simile there, comparing him lying in his 4-foot box, so that gives us an indication of his age straight away, because it's quite a small coffin, as in his cot. I mean, there's not, you really get the idea that we're dealing with somebody very young now, because it's been, he looks as if, almost as if he's just sleeping in his cot, with the exception of this big bruise and the fact that he's a little bit paler. No gaudy scars, the bumper knocked him clear. And this is where it really gets driven home, that final line, a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. So this is the big reveal that he passed away at the age of 4. Seamus Heaney's younger brother. And one thing I always like to highlight is that alliteration there, a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. Now, if you think about that noise, there's a frustration to that. There's a tension. It almost sounds as if you're on the verge of swearing or shouting out. It's like a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. So you do get the sense through that alliteration that there's a great deal of anger. Now, in this poem, there's all kinds of themes here at play of loss and grief, for example. There's perhaps arguably a message here about taking loved ones for granted. I mean, it's ultimately up for you and your teacher to determine what that message is. But it's important, I think, that you at least get a sense of the range of techniques here. And I think the one thing I really want to stress from this very, very brief walkthrough of the poem is that there's no such thing as a complete annotation. This is just some techniques which could be pointed out. There's definitely ones I've missed out, because if I think I've tried to include everything, I'd be here all night. And it may be that I've highlighted things that your teacher hasn't highlighted if you're looking at this from a different class, and it might be the opposite is true. It might be that your teacher highlights things which I've not got. That doesn't mean either of us are right or wrong. It simply means that there are lots of ways to look at this poem and look at any poetry really and interpret it. So I'll stop there. I hope this has been helpful, and good luck with whatever qualification you're working towards this year. Take care.